From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Kate Walsh. The race for the White House is really starting to take shape now. This past week, Massachusetts joined more than a dozen states in Super Tuesday primaries or caucuses. Our civic duty in Massachusetts is over now until the general election in November, but what happens next across the country still very much impacts each American. So for full analysis on the presidential campaigns, we have Dr. John Back, professor of history at Western New England University, and political consultant Tony Signoli. Thank you both for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks.
So we are in the heart of primary season now. Massachusetts, many others already had Super Tuesday, but there's many more ahead of us. Some people say that the primaries don't matter. This year we've seen that's far from the truth. So we want to start with you, John. What is the history of the primaries? How did it all start, and what's its importance nowadays?
Well, looking at this in the long view, the American political system has been divided from the very beginning, from the question of the Constitution. At different times, basically every generation or two, it's been changed. It's been kingmakers and back rooms, it's been national conventions. Then it moved to primaries in the early 20th century as something called the progressive era, the idea that the people themselves in the states should have more of a say in what's going on. So for several decades, it was about each individual state's contests deciding who will be the national contestant. But over the years, that itself has coalesced and changed. So we've reached a position now where although the people in each state have their will, some states matter more, and there are still kingmakers out there who think they can control things.
And can you talk a little bit about that? You're talking about delegates and how each state has a different number. That's to represent the population, right?
They are basically proportionately distributed by the national parties. But where the primary system first began in the early 20th century as a way of blocking the power of the party elites, it has become something that is very comfortable with the party elites. So you have a few hundred people in Washington, D.C. and in state houses around the country. You have former politicians, you have industrialists, you have all sorts of people who are involved, and they are the ones who are guiding the policies and direction of their party. But you also have thousands of politicians who are active and millions of voters. It's kind of an elaborate dance going on. At different times, the national parties have exerted a different authority, but we've really never seen anything quite like this year.
That's for sure, and we'll be talking a lot about that. In the 1960s, I believe, 1968, that was a monumental year for conventions, right? Could you talk a little bit about the history, the recent history of primaries?
Sure. From the Republican side, 1968 was not that uneventful. Richard Nixon is someone who won comfortably. For the Democrats, they actually started the year with President Lyndon Johnson, who was the incumbent, and he was running for re-election, and he was winning somewhat comfortably, but with some challenges. But as the challenges became greater, as the Vietnam War turned worse, Lyndon Johnson surprised everyone by dropping out. Suddenly, you had several candidates who emerged. You had Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and you reached a convention filled with chaos because the person who had the most momentum, not enough to win outright, but the person who had the most momentum was the recently slain Robert Kennedy. So the 1968 convention was a mess. You had rioting outside, rioting inside, and the Democratic establishment thought, we're going to pick our candidate. This had huge consequences for the party, for their platform, and for the eventual loss of the party in 1968.
So we might see something not like that, let's hope, but something significantly historic this year at the conventions, possibly. Tony, could you talk a little bit about the importance of the primaries and what it means leading up to the convention this year?
Well, as we're seeing right now, it's the primary victories for each candidate that is setting the stage for what's to come, whether we're looking at the Democratic or the Republican side. You know, these primaries, you know, Iowa, New Hampshire, these early contests, whatever anyone may think of them, as absurd as they may seem, a caucus versus a primary, the apparatus that gets rolled out for this, you know, who actually votes, who doesn't, the fact that the universe of these voters in primaries and caucuses is different than those that we see in November. These aren't all the folks that come out. Is this really representative of the will of the people overall? That's always a question. But the bottom line, it's the gauntlet. And there was a great line by John F. Kennedy, judge someone by how they run as to what type of public servant they might be able to be. And I think that's one thing that we're seeing this time around that we can look at here. Look at the folks who have fallen by the wayside on the Republican side of the contest right now, who just could not stand the rigor of this process, so to speak. Is this the best way to pick a nominee? Probably not overall, but it is what it is. And look at where we are right now. Pretty amazing.
And we've seen voter turnout at amazing levels this year. They've broken records in, I believe, every state but Vermont
Absolutely.
so far.
Yeah.
So what is driving people out to the polls? Why this year are people really taking interest in the primaries?
I think it's a combination of things. It's certainly the phenomenon of Donald Trump, the anomaly that began really maybe last July or August, this wild thing that's the Donald Trump campaign. But it's more than that. When 28 million people are going to turned on their televisions to watch a debate last August, when there were all these great games of baseball being played, there were a million other things happening, and it's August, something's happening. Folks are tuning in a new way. Is it the net? Is it the internet? It's certainly not the parties that are driving this. It's not old-line politics. I think the bigger piece, though, and I see it in poll after poll that we have the opportunity to read the crosstabs of, why are people turning up? Why are they thinking the way they are? There is an anger out there. And it's not just the Trump anger. It's the anger that's fueling the Bernie Sanders movement. It's an overall anger of folks, of independents, unenrolled, and a heck of a lot of Democrats, too, who are saying, I'm angry, I'm mad as heck, and I've got to send some kind of a message. They're not really sure what they want to do, where they are, what candidate they are, as much as they are sure that they're angry and they want some kind of a revolution. What's amazing to me is looking at the polls before each election day, before each primary or caucus, and I think we talked about this when we were up in New Hampshire. What shocked me was on the Sunday before the Tuesday election to be seeing so many undecideds in New Hampshire, which isn't a strange thing for us. We've seen this before in New Hampshire, but to see so many and to see where they were breaking the next day or the day after that, rather, and to see all those undecided independents making a choice between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. That's astounding to me in my profession, because that's like Rolls-Royce Phantom versus Toyota Prius. I mean, normally you can't make up your mind between two folks that are much more closely aligned philosophically or ideology.
Have we seen this in recent years or in history for that matter, something like this where people are so undecided and so angry leading up to primaries?
Well, we've seen elections in which anger fueled the electorate, but we've also seen elections in which the power of the parties was able to temper that. This anger, this frustration, this disillusionment is something that has been a staple of American politics now, not just for the last 7 years, but really for the last generation.
Yeah.
It is about a distrust in government, a distrust in institutions. We've been told over and over that every election is the most important, and vote for me because I'll stand for you against them. And whoever that them is, whoever that target is now something that for a full generation of Americans, if you were born in the 1980s, all you've ever heard was anti in politics. There just isn't much of a pro message. This frustration, combined with the economic recession and the slow recovery, combined with the realization that all of these messages and all of these promises haven't been fulfilled, people are looking for an answer. And they're looking at Twitter, and they're looking at Facebook, and they're looking at Snapchat, and they're looking at these debates almost as a form not just of entertainment and content and reality TV, which they all are, but they're looking at that for someone who can speak to them and speak for them. And certainly Donald Trump has done a remarkable job communicating, understanding how people communicate now. For a time, Bernie Sanders had that, but you see that momentum dying out. At this point, talking about Bernie Sanders is somewhat tangential. I would think that he's drifting back. Comparisons can be made to Howard Dean.
Sure,
but
very much so.
The idea that Americans are looking for something genuine, something unfiltered, and someone who mirrors their anger and gives them a target.
But do they really believe that this time around, this year, all of that change is going to happen? They were frustrated in 2008, 2004, and some believe that nothing may have happened. So do they really believe that by voting this time around, that's all going to change?
I think a lot of the Trump supporters do. They really believe that because he is so different, because he is something that they've never seen before. I mean, he is the duck-billed platypus of politics. He just has a little bit of everything, and it makes no sense, but why not run with it? They really believe that he can tear up Washington. I'm not sure that they recognize what the implications might be, but they just know that he's different. I do think that his supporters think he's genuine. I do think his supporters think that he's going to make a huge change in Washington. And I do know that there's a large percentage of the country, both Republicans, Democrats, and independents, who are terrified that the changes he might bring are so unpredictable.
And we'll talk a lot more about Donald Trump and also the Democratic frontrunner right now, Hillary Clinton, when we come back from the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're looking back at Super Tuesday this past week and looking forward to what's next in the race for the White House. And we're joined by Dr. John Beck, professor of history at Western New England University, and political consultant Tony Signoli. So let's analyze the candidates now, those who are left in the race. We'll start with the front runners, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, after Super Tuesday, that is. Trump won 7 states, so did Clinton, just on Super Tuesday alone. People are joking about him, they have been for months, but it's obvious that he's being taken seriously at the same time because he's winning big across the country. Tony, you mentioned he's the anomaly that's now
a phenomenon.
Phenomenon. What is it about him?
It's that we've never seen this before. We've seen Donald Trump for almost 3 decades, but we've never seen this running for the presidency. It is, in every interview I've had the opportunity to do with him at a radio station in Boston, I've always been stunned. We never know what to expect. There's no planning, there's no anything. And you can see he's not got any game plan in front of him. He's got no agenda as he's coming in other than the agenda of Trump himself. And there's nothing planned. It just rolls. And I've been in a room interviewing him with 3 or 4 serious journalists and then just me, a political consultant. And there's no way to corral this guy. It's like trying to herd 30 wild buffaloes at one time. But one thing that he is able to do is always go back to his message. The message, as John said, that plays with those folks who are supporting him. You know, so much of the focus is on Donald Trump. When you look at this group of folks that are supporting Donald Trump, this isn't the Tea Party element alone. This isn't, you know, all kinds of fringe groups. There's a lot of average, regular folks in America who are really upset and are saying, I'm sick and tired of trying to do the same old thing, the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again with the Democrats, the Republicans, and expecting a different outcome. These folks really, I don't know if they so much believe that he can make change, but they hope that he can. They're hoping.
From a cultural perspective, I mean, Donald Trump has been famous his entire life. Not that many people have birth announcements in the New York Times when they're born. Not that many people are going to inherit an empire. He inherited an empire, he inherited a name, and he has spent his entire life not just as a businessman in a general term. He is focused on being a celebrity. Long before Paris Hilton or Kim Kardashian, Donald Trump was famous for being famous. He was in Studio 54 in the 1970s. He was calling for the death penalty in the Central Park Jogger case back in the 1980s. He was the one that pushed the birther theories, all with the goal of being famous. His weekly show on a network I won't name right now drew 7 million people a week. He was famous for so long, and everyone knows who he is. You take that fame, you take that celebrity, and you marry it to someone who can answer your prayers, answer your anger. This is not so different than the people who signed up for Trump University. He said he would make people rich, and people believed him. It was a lot of the same kind of people demographically, from all across the spectrum, from people who lost a job to people who never worked. They believe in his name. They believe in his brand. It's one of the biggest names out there.
We're seeing in the debates that he and the other Republican candidates are attacking each other for their personalities and their histories versus what they believe in as so far as issues. But Trump has promised that if he does make it through all of these rounds, the primaries and then the general election, and becomes president, he will be presidential. Why would he all of a sudden change from becoming kind of this outlandish, speak from his mind, whatever he wants character to a presidential figure around the world?
We both want to throw that to one another because what's the answer to that with Donald Trump? We throw out the book completely here. We've never seen this before. But you would think at this point, he's got to start being presidential. Perhaps that was the goal at Mar-a-Lago the other evening, you know, when he was introduced by Chris Christie after a big victories on Super Tuesday. You would expect maybe that was the idea because it was such a sober event. It wasn't the usual Trump yelling, howling, screaming rally. It wasn't what we've seen others do on a big Super Tuesday. You usually go into a large room, a gigantic pep rally, the confetti, the this. It's perfect for Donald Trump, for the circus. And yet he didn't do that. He called a media conference. He answered questions. That's not what you do normally on that night. So the unpredictability of Donald Trump makes it even more impossible for us to even perhaps try to answer that question with any honesty, I think, overall. But there is a moment when an electorate stops to think, this is the presidency of the United States. This is a party, the party of Lincoln. We've been hearing that a lot from the Republican establishment as they're shocked and stunned by Donald Trump. My God, the party of Lincoln. It's also the presidency, where TR roared, where FDR got up out of his wheelchair and saved the nation, where JFK took on Khrushchev, where Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's the presidency. At some point in time, does that kick into this? And where are the other larger-than-life players who step into that mantle that this is the presidency? Where's a Reagan right now? Where is a JFK?
And you know, I think we actually have a soundbite from the night he won so many states on Super Tuesday, so let's listen to that.
I am a unifier. Once we get all of this finished, I'm going to go after one person. That's Hillary Clinton, on the assumption she's allowed to run, which is a big assumption. I don't know that she's going to be allowed to run. And I think that's frankly going to be an easy race. You see the polls. I beat Hillary in many polls.
So after hearing that, he's talking about unifying the party, but we're hearing from dozens of top Republicans. We heard from Mitt Romney this past week, all saying he cannot do this. He's dividing the party. He's taking away delegates from the other candidates who may be more establishment candidates. What are your thoughts on that? Will he eventually unite the party, do you think?
No, I don't see how he could possibly unite the party. It doesn't mean that he can't win. I mean, a lot of Donald Trump's support has to come from independent voters, has to come from disaffected Democrats. Ronald Reagan could not have won the presidency without what's called the Reagan Democrats. So Donald Trump could change the contours, could change the meaning of the Republican Party, which is one reason why Republicans are fighting back so hard against him. Not just the three remaining candidates, but the establishment, journalists, much of the apparatus of the Republican Party. Donald Trump, his agenda is himself. He says things, and if you believe him, if you take him at his word, then he's the best person for the job. But for the majority of Republicans so far, and certainly for the majority of Americans, he has this ceiling of support. If he's polling at 30, 40, even 50%, that's among people who are paying attention, people who are very motivated, but a small group of people. As Tony was saying, as we get to the larger electorate, as we have several months, at a certain point, he can no longer just lob personal attacks. He's going to attack someone like Hillary Clinton if he gets the nomination and if she does. And he has no plans. He has no programs. The things he's talking about don't add up. And there is simply no way that Americans who look at the issues carefully will want to support him. The thing about Donald Trump is that he is bringing in so many new players. Voter registration in this country has not been high for a long time, and we have nothing like the turnout in some industrial democracies. If he can bring out this kind of excitement and this kind of energy, he can change all the rules in politics, at least for this cycle.
So with him winning so many delegates so far, when it comes to the convention this summer, and you know he basically has enough to be the nominee, is there any way that the Republicans who are speaking out right now, so angry that he's doing so well, is there any way they could change that all and have someone else be their nominee?
Well, he needs a lot more delegates than he has right now, but if things continue as they are, he'll pick those delegates up, especially in some of the winner-take-all states. You know, as we look forward, ahead, to an Ohio, to a Florida, to down the road to California, you know, there's the thought that John Kasich can at least hold Ohio. But the way that I just said that, that's the way that I heard that from John Kasich's #2 guy, that at least we can hold. That's not very confident. In Florida, Trump leads Rubio right now in Florida by 20 points. And to better answer your question, the traditional establishment Republicans, well, a big part of that establishment is the Bush family. And when Marco Rubio returns home to Florida, he'll be answered by Jeb Bush, who's furious. They believe that Marco Rubio has helped to deny Jeb Bush this presidency. And the former governor of Florida and that incredible apparatus that he still has in Florida, they're not going to go out there with rose petals, I think, for Marco Rubio. They're not going to be out there to give him a hand. It's possible that you see some of these large states fall for Trump. So when you get to the convention, if he's got the delegates or he's close to it, for the Republican apparatus, for the Republican National Committee to try to deny Donald Trump at that time, I can't even imagine the optics of that or what that looks like. There will be people in the streets. It will be like 1968 at the Democratic Convention, because Trump can play a different game and he can put out the great and public call. I won this fair and square. You won this fair and square. You put me here, and they're trying to stop me. My God, can you imagine what that would look like, the optics of that convention? And the Democrats would love it if that were the case.
And we'll take a break right now, but when we get back, we'll talk about Hillary Clinton, of course, and the Democrats. Bernie Sanders still in the race as well. So we'll be right back with all of that. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the race for the White House, including the candidates, the primaries, the voters, and everything that makes this presidential election year very unique. So we were just talking about Donald Trump, and now we want to talk a little bit about the other Republican candidates and their chances still in the race, and then we'll transition to Hillary Clinton and the Democratic side. So let's start where we left off and talk about the other Republican candidates and their possible chances now to win the nomination.
There's almost no doubt at this point, barring some miracle, that Donald Trump will get the most delegates. But will he get the majority? You need a simple majority, but that term simple is pretty complicated. He needs 1,237, 1,237. So far, if you look at the polling and you're looking ahead, he's going to get somewhere close to that. But if he loses a couple of states or if he doesn't get enough votes, some of these delegates are given out by proportion, and hundreds of delegates are not given out at all. They are about party insiders who will not pledge for Donald Trump. He needs to really run the table to win the nomination outright. And if he doesn't, Republicans have promised a brokered convention. It's something that Mitt Romney talked about Thursday morning, a plan where the three remaining candidates, Kasich, Cruz, and Rubio, will each win a handful or a bushel full of delegates, enough to block Trump. It's an anyone but Trump Republican Party that almost seems content to lose the race but keep their party. This is something that has happened before. It happened when Teddy Roosevelt ran as an independent, and it happens when a party says, well, we may end up losing to voter anger, but we can't lose our identity as a party.
We heard Ted Cruz this past week ask the other candidates who weren't doing as well, Ben Carson, Marco Rubio, they hadn't picked up any states on Super Tuesday, to consider possibly dropping out so that the other candidates who actually are gaining some momentum will get more and again fight against Donald Trump. Do we see that as a possibility that they will?
I don't, not behind Ted Cruz, and for the other reason that is not spoken that much outside of Washington, but we're hearing it a lot the last few weeks. In Washington, Ted Cruz is probably the most least liked member of the United States Senate. There isn't a member of the Senate supporting him. There are no great tears being cried for this guy in the Republican circles of the Capitol. He just doesn't have that kind of media and personal and political capital earned or accrued over the course of time that he's been there. So I don't see that. It's not Cruz. You know, is there the opportunity to get behind someone else? Gosh, if John Kasich could catch fire somehow, if Marco Rubio could actually take his home state and do a little better than that. There's a zillion different scenarios, but as John said, it's all math at this point. It really is. The problem here, I think, is that the remaining candidates have been damaged enough or just aren't of stature enough to be able to pull this off and become the other. We've been hearing this now for 5 or 6 weeks. You know, the establishment candidate, you know, the final 9 are fighting to be the establishment candidate to come in from the outside track. It never happened. It's just, there's no Reagan there. There's no Jack Kemp, there's no George Bush or any of the other players that we've seen actually be successful. It's just not there right now. So this is still jump ball.
Now, go ahead.
And putting aside the math, there is a chance now with the all-out Republican Party assault on Donald Trump now. There is a chance that the convention can yield the person who's the presidential candidate without the most delegates initially. If you're a delegate, you're only sworn in most cases on the first ballot to vote for your candidate. So they would have to vote for Donald Trump even if they didn't like him on the first ballot. He doesn't get 1, 2, 3, 7. They can switch their votes. But you can be assured that he will run as a third-party candidate. It will guarantee Republican loss. He can't win, but he would do this just to continue his quest, his Trumpism. Again, the Republicans, I think it's fair to say that a lot of them avoided attacking Trump for fear of driving him into a third-party bid. But now he has reached this point where he represents an existential threat to the meaning of the party.
Let's switch to the Democratic Party now. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, it's been the two of them for a while in the race, just the two of them. Looking at Super Tuesday, Hillary Clinton won 7 states. What do we see now in the future for future primaries? Does it seem like Bernie Sanders has a chance to pick up enough delegates to really stay in the race?
You know, as you project forward, there's a great movement there for Bernie Sanders. There is. There's a lot of new people that have come into the party for Bernie Sanders who are hearing his message, who are fired up. We keep hearing about young folks in that regard. But there's also a lot of people in the Midwest right now who feel for what Bernie Sanders is saying, especially his attacks, not just on Wall Street, but on K Street, the lobbyists. Those are the folks who are underemployed. Those are the folks who have lost a job because of one trade pact or another. Michigan should be a place where Bernie Sanders would do good. But the problem that he's got overall is an African-American base of the Democratic Party, Hispanic Latino base, that he's just not firing up. There are a lot of folks that when you poll them in those communities, they agree with him on these issues, but they're looking at something else too. They're looking at electability. They're looking at a winner. There's that aspect of this. The math doesn't look great for Bernie Sanders. Is it over yet? No. And then there's another element here in this campaign that you always hear about the great thing that might happen, or this might happen, or that could happen. But are there issues for Hillary Clinton with these emails? Are there, aren't there, whatever? There's always that hope trail that's out there too. Does a Bernie Sanders, though, stay in a campaign based on something like that? Not Bernie Sanders. He's above that. And we've seen that. This is a fella who could have fired a lot of torpedoes at Hillary Clinton. He didn't do it. Whether folks like Bernie Sanders or don't in the Democratic Party, they should be thankful to him for not firing a lot more and putting some holes in that hull.
Yeah. And if we're going to keep this nautical reference and this nautical metaphor, which is a good one, Bernie Sanders has been a surprise this season. He's gone much further than anyone expected. He is very much an outsider, even though he's been a senator for a very long time. Think of Bernie Sanders as a very strong wind. It is pushing the Democratic Party ship in a direction that people didn't expect it to go. Hillary Clinton is someone who has been at the controls or near the controls for a long time. And she is not someone who thought she would have to run to her left, as they say. She would have to run as a more liberal candidate. She, though, still believes in this Democratic Party ship, and so does Bernie Sanders. He is not going to sink it. He is not going to run it into the ground. I think he is serious when he says he's going to run through June, because Hillary Clinton will not have the delegates mathematically until towards the end. Mathematically looking ahead, because there's proportional delegates, you can lose a state and still get 45% of the delegates. It's basically impossible for Bernie Sanders to win, especially because basically all the superdelegates, as they call them for Democrats, have pledged to Hillary Clinton already. But he wants to keep pushing that ship. He wants to keep being that wind. And he wants to motivate young people, and he wants to motivate people who aren't as interested in politics as they have been in the past. He is a smaller version of Donald Trump in that sense of trying to bring new people in and bring a new energy. And I think as far as I saw earlier this week, he is the leading candidate on Snapchat. I'm not sure how relevant this is, but very few people that age do Snapchat, much less lead all the other candidates. Yeah, Rubio dropped the ball on that one.
Well said. That is very well said. As the younger candidate there, yeah. It is amazing that he's been able to do this at 75 years old, a bit of a caricature in every way. Certainly Larry David plays him very well and whatnot, but it is astonishing. This is a grand win.
When we're looking towards the convention, have we ever seen in the past that on the Democratic side there was just one candidate left in the race, no one to contend with when it came to the nomination process, or is there always at least 2 people in the race?
It's actually one of the reasons why Super Tuesday exists. Super Tuesday was originally created back in the 80s by southern states that wanted to make sure that they were listened to. They felt that they were being overwhelmed by northern states, by western states. They wanted to put themselves together as a bloc. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. But Super Tuesday, as you have more states joining in nationally, ends up becoming usually the knockout round for both the Democrats and the Republicans. You've gone through Iowa, which is an odd one. You've gone through New Hampshire, which is a bit more established. You've gone through a few other states, and occasionally some states try to jump the line and go earlier. But Super Tuesday for both parties usually is the moment where you know who the nominee is. They may not have quite enough delegates by math, but it becomes inevitable at that point. In 2008, by Super Tuesday, Barack Obama was in the same position that Hillary Clinton is in now. If you look forward, he had the math on his side. Wasn't yet the nominee and wouldn't be till June. I think the same thing will be the case with Hillary. This has an advantage for a candidate. They can really focus on their possible and probable opponents, but it also diminishes somewhat the focus, the attention. You talked about record turnout, and that's true for Republicans, but Democratic turnout has been pretty ho-hum. Where were the young Bernie Sanders supporters? Where were the UMass students who were there in New Hampshire knocking on doors? Did they turn out to vote for him, or have they moved on to something else? Maybe it was too cold on election day.
You never know. That is a possibility.
points.
Weather
Good
does
points.
affect turnout, right? All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk more about Hillary Clinton, and then we're going to get into the issues that voters are really concerned about leading up to the general election in November. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. This week we're talking about everything concerning the road to the White House, the presidential election of 2016. That's very unique this year based on the candidates. We were just talking about Hillary Clinton when we left off. So we're actually going to hear her on Super Tuesday, or right after Super Tuesday, and how her plan of attack might have changed.
You know, the stakes in this election have never been higher, and the rhetoric from the other side has never been lower. So we've got work to do, my friends, but not to make America great again. America never stopped being great.
She continues saying we're going to make America whole again, and that's kind of become her mantra this past week. She said it a lot. Are we seeing her change her focus now from she's still fighting against Bernie Sanders, but it seems like she's now going right to Donald Trump? And are we seeing that happen, and is that smart to do?
I think it's smart in the sense that Hillary Clinton has a tremendous history and a tremendous record of public service, but she also has accrued many tremendous negatives, some because of her husband, some because of her own career. And a lot of Democrats heading into this season were nervous about these negatives, the way that Republicans were nervous about Jeb Bush, and right about Jeb. Yeah. What Hillary needs above all is a reason for people to vote for her in which her negatives fade into the background. And what she is going to try to run is, I am competent, I am capable, I am rational. You vote for me and I will keep America going in this direction and try to make life better. You vote for the other guy, we are going to crash, we are going to sink, it will be a disaster. This is, in some respects, the dream opponent for her, someone for whom her negatives pale in comparison. If she was voting against a charismatic, young Republican, it might be a difficult thing. But you can now see Hillary Clinton potentially running as the grandmother-in-chief. I've lived it, I know it, and I know what this kind of guy is. Whereas Donald Trump is going to keep trying to run as the cool uncle. You see him at Thanksgiving, he says a lot of stuff, and he has an interesting car. It's going to be a contest of personalities, and she's going to try to run as the voice of experience and wisdom who has the scars to show for it.
Will she try to distinguish herself from President Obama and her husband, Bill Clinton, or will she try to ride off their coattails?
You know, there's a little bit of the coattail piece, but what we've seen from her already is that she's got her own thoughts and ideas, her own philosophies. She'll know from polling where that helps her or hurts her. But what she's really got to do now is, John said that brilliantly, everything he just said. But I'd add maybe one piece to that. She's also got to find a way to reintroduce herself, yet again, a woman that has reinvented and reintroduced herself for 40 years, over and over again, to an electorate that doesn't know who she is. Yeah, the grandma piece works for her, it does. She's got to remind women as to why they should be for her. If people don't know what you've done, then you didn't do it. And there's a group of almost 35 and under in that age group that she's got to reintroduce herself to say, here's what I did so that you might be where you are right now as a young woman, you know, thinking of your career down the road or, you know, in college, etc. And the other thing she's got to do, she's got to do another piece of the economy here, similar to what Bill Clinton did in 1992. He knew that, as it's famously been said by James Carville, you know, when he walked into the war room one day, Carville put up on the wall, it's the economy, stupid, you know? It's, you know, keep it simple, and it's the economy, stupid. And that's what this is right now, too. But it's a different kind of economy she's got to speak to. She's got to speak to those folks out there that Bernie Sanders is connected with and Donald Trump, the underemployed, the folks who didn't get theirs. We see it here in Massachusetts all the time in polling. Boston, every day I leave there, I go, my gosh, I didn't see that building last week. Or look at this. It's just stunning what's happening in Boston. And then I come home to Western Massachusetts. The nation feels like that. And as this campaign gets into the Midwest right now, those are the folks she's got to speak to, those who didn't get theirs. And she's got to be able to say to them, America is good, America is great, but I understand you lagged behind in these last years. We saved the economy. Barack Obama, George Bush to Barack Obama, the saving of, you know, Wall Street in Detroit. Yeah, we did that. We had to keep America great. And now I'm going to find a way to get that back to you on your Main Street.
And at the same time, she has to do something that has been increasingly difficult in the last generation. She has to say that government is good, not a necessary evil. Government is on your side. Government should provide you with clean water. Government should provide you with safe roads. Government should provide you with loans that won't burden you for the rest of your life. If she can't sell the government to the American people, she can't win in November.
But Donald Trump doesn't have much experience in government either, so will there be a balance there with how much they want to talk about the government and how much they want to talk about the issues that matter most to the people?
Well, Trump's issues so far have been pretty much anything he wants to talk about. He has run this populist campaign where he's appealing to people's economic insecurities. He's run a nativist campaign where you're trying to say that all the problems of the world are because of immigrants, legal and otherwise. He doesn't really have any platform, any agenda, except to say that I will make whatever you think is wrong better. I will do this through my own style. I will be the chief executive. I will be the CEO of America. He can actually ride this 40-year-long crest of momentum that's anti-government. One thing that people may not remember is that Ronald Reagan, who was our president, won in part by saying, don't trust Washington. Send me to Washington because you don't trust it. People want to vote for Trump because he's saying, I'm just going to tear the whole thing down. I mean, he may put neon on the White House, and people would find that fascinating.
You never know. We're going to take another commercial break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the issues and what American voters are really thinking leading up to the election in November. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We've been talking about the presidential candidates this year, and now we're going to talk about the issues, what voters care about or what we think they're caring about, other than looking at the candidates' personalities. That seems to be what we've seen a lot in the debates on the Democratic and Republican side thus far, just attacking personalities. But at some point, we'll probably have to see more about the issues, right? We would think.
We would hope. Yeah.
If you've watched the Democratic debates, they've actually not just been lacking in personal attacks, but they've been focused on policy differences. And Senator Sanders is presenting the most liberal, the most progressive agenda seen since Lyndon Johnson, one that goes far beyond anything Barack Obama has done or even ever talked about, whereas Hillary Clinton has talked about basically the pretty standard center-left Democratic message. The government is going to help you where it can. It can't do everything, but we can do more. We can improve on health care. We can improve on student loans, and we certainly can try to start providing some jobs and support for the economy that helps the little guy. Perhaps Hillary Clinton will come up with something, and Senator Sanders hasn't yet, where you deal with the fact that these corporations are going overseas and not paying taxes anymore. When it comes to the Republicans, all of those issues, everything that we expected to be talked about have just disappeared because Donald Trump is this blender, taking every issue and shredding them. And he is not just running as a conservative or as a Republican. He says the right things when it comes to abortion for Republicans, but he also talks about Planned Parenthood as a good thing. No Republican does that in national office. He is just throwing every candidate deeply, deeply off balance to the point where there are no issues on the Republican side. It's just personalities.
How big of an issue is the war and foreign affairs when it comes to the Republicans during the debate? I believe I heard them speak a little bit about that early on, at least. It might have changed since then with them attacking each other and their personalities, but will we see that a little bit more, do you think?
You would hope that would be the case, but look at the debate where the nuclear triad was brought up and where it was clear Donald Trump wasn't really familiar with what that was. Marco Rubio gave us a military civics lesson and explained what it was, and yet no one cared. It made no bump, no nothing. So I think John is right. I think of that old Saturday Night Live skit with the Bassomatic and Dan Aykroyd. That's what this is like. Just throwing everything in there and spinning around. But again, at some point in time, that should change. An electorate starts to think about that this is the leader of the free world, so to speak, that this is the president of the United States, the person who's going to be sitting behind the big desk, with the red phone. This is the person that gets the call, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Mr. President, we need you, or Madam President, we need you in the Situation Room. And I think back to 2008 when Hillary Clinton went after Barack Obama in that regard and ran those ads very hard, hitting him. He has no experience. I do. And there's experience in my family, and I have this experience. So when the phone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning and I, Hillary Clinton, go to the Situation Room, I know what to do. At some point, I think that kicks in. And then there's the other piece of this, too. Does divine providence of politics kick in? Does something happen? Is there an event, a world event or a national event that occurs that makes us stop to think, this is the commander-in-chief?
For all of these scenarios, the unexpected, and it really comes down to if there is something like a terrorist attack, whether it is something like a couple of really unhinged, sad people in San Bernardino, or whether it's something connected to actually like Al-Qaeda or ISIL, those things could skew the electorate, skew the turnout dramatically. It could take a 5-point deficit and turn it into a tie in one day. But putting that aside, putting those intangibles aside, at a certain point when there are just two candidates, a candidate can no longer just resort to personal attacks. I mean, watch the debates. When Donald Trump says, "excuse me," he means something that's not at all "excuse me." It's the most hostile "excuse me" in the history of the world. You can't do that when there's only two people on the stage. Donald Trump will not be able to avoid the spotlight. He won't be able to deny questions when it's just two people. And at that point, not just a lack of knowledge, but this incredible lack of specificity. He has no plans. It's all in his head. It's all just showmanship and all just selling. But the American people won't necessarily keep buying this when they see over and over that he doesn't have specifics.
Some people I've talked to as I've been covering the campaigns for the past few months have said that they don't really care who's president because there are so many other players in Washington that can either counter what the president might be proposing or just go on their own and pass bills, before the president signs it, of course, but talking about issues and having influence and other people and members of the cabinet who can make so much change around the world that the office of the president isn't that important to them. Does that seem right to you guys?
But it's still the president who has to pick that administration. It's still the president who's got to make all those appointments, and there are thousands and thousands of presidential appointments that we're not all that familiar with. We're familiar with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're familiar with the folks that sit around the big table, the administration, the secretary of this or the secretary of that. That is something that I think is heavy to look at, and as we come down to two, when that time comes, you'll start to hear what their thoughts are on those appointments. But the presidency is important for that reason. Certainly there's the members of the House and the members of the United States Senate. The checks and the balances and the way it was all designed to work by the founding fathers. But still, the president has the bully pulpit. When 9/11 happened, it wasn't the Speaker of the House that went out to New York or the leader of the Senate. It was the President of the United States. And that's the same thing through any crisis. When Barack Obama became President of the United States, it wasn't the Speaker of the House or members of the Senate that showed up and say, here's how the heck we're going to bail out Detroit and why. Here's how we make this happen. And it's the President who has the power of executive order. Whether we like it or don't like it, whether we look to Lincoln and his example with executive order or Barack Obama's, that's the President.
I mean, to that person's concern, and there's a lot of people who feel this way, a lot of my students feel this way, I just say Scalia, because the choice of the next Supreme Court justice will almost certainly go to the next president.
Wow. Yeah.
And the way the Supreme Court rules can dramatically shape people's lives overnight. People can be married or they can't. They can have control over their reproduction or they can't, based on 9 people in Washington, which is now 8. It also is the case that the president often sets the agenda and the tenor and the culture for America. When John F. Kennedy was president, he inspired a generation to pursue public service. When Ronald Reagan was president, he launched a wave of conservatism that we are still feeling in our nation. The person in the White House sets the tenor, sets the tone for where we are as a nation and a people and where we are in world affairs. It still matters deeply. But your questioners are exactly right. It also matters who your mayor is and who your governor is. And it has to be something where politics is part of our nation as opposed to something that's just kind of a sideshow every few years.
There are other elections this year other than the election of our next president. So how will those elections play into what's going to happen in Washington after November?
Well, I don't think we see that much change happening in the House, but in the Senate, there's that opportunity that there could be change. We know that the Republican leaders, for an example, have given indication to candidates and incumbents on the Republican Senate side who are in contended seats that they need to be very careful of what's happening in the national discourse right now and of this new wave of Donald Trump. Is there enough change that would come around, though, that would have a large impact? I still don't see that just yet. But this is such a wild and such a different time right now. Does something happen? Is there just such an anger out there? Does this anger that focuses more easily on one, does it at all filter over to the many? Not sure of that yet. Looking at a lot of polls, and the average person out there still sees all their problems or all their hopes, on that one individual that sits in the Oval Office. They don't get that fact that it's that member of Congress that they keep sending back to Washington that has just as big of an impact, or maybe more, depending on what chairmanship they have or what committee that they sit on.
Most of the members of the House of Representatives, they're up for re-election every 2 years, but they're in safe districts. It would take a tidal wave kind of moment to change that. But several Republican senators are vulnerable. And these are the types of people who need independent voters and sometimes Democrats to win. You're going to see some of these senators running away from a Donald Trump, running as fast as they can without actually physically running, because his kind of voters could cost them deeply in this election.
Very interesting. We'll be back in just a few minutes with our last word. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You've been watching 22 News in Focus. Today we spoke with Dr. John Back, professor of history at Western New England University, and political consultant Tony Signoli. So that's our program for this Sunday. We want to thank our guests for joining us, and thanks to you at home for watching us. If you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website, wwlp.com. And from all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday.